Hi, welcome back to the show. Nice to see you. Big one today. Dave Troy is our guest. We're going to get to him in just a second. Dave Troy, maybe one of my favorite Twitter follows, way smarter than me. You're going to love this fucking podcast, I can tell you that. And it's made possible by our friends at thedailymushroom.co and momentmushrooms.com. Moment Mushrooms, BC-based wellness brand focused on transformative power of psilocybin mushrooms to support inner growth, mental health, 100% committed to plastic-free packaging, quality organic ingredients. They're huge fans of their products. And I mean, I'm a massive fan of their product. All of my high-heeled friends are massive fans of their products as well. But more importantly, their stories and the resources that are available over at Moment Mushrooms as well. If you're thinking of macro dosing or micro dosing, and I've done it a few times, more than a few, it's part of my daily routine. These guys made it easy. Very, very easy. They give me a juicy sense of ease, trust in myself. Happy to introduce our Canadian listeners to my friends at Moment Mushrooms. Go to momentmushrooms.com and check them out today. Variety of products, variety of stories, and a variety of things that you can interact with that'll make your life a million times better. All these transformative stories that people had, I had to look into it for myself. And that's why I'm a Moment Mushrooms client. That's why they are now a Moment Mushrooms partner here for the Dean Blundell Show. Couldn't be happier to have these guys as part of our team, make them part of your team today. And as well, our friends over the Daily Mushroom. This is brought to you by Daily Mushroom. You're sitting there going, what's with all the mushrooms? Dude, I'm all in. I'm all in. This is one of the most fascinating, emergent plant-based medicines that you will find. And it's been thousands of years in the making. And the Nixon administration tried to tell everybody it wasn't fun. You can't get better for it. Nah. You want to learn about mushrooms and psilocybin, and you want stories and studies from Johns Hopkins, McGill, you want to know about the business of mushrooms, there is one definitive resource in North America. It's called The Daily Mushroom. Go to dailymushroom.co. Again, dailymushroom.ca. Join their community. They've got this incredible VIP rewards program coming as well. So make sure you get there. And not only when you sign up, you get a newsletter with maybe 3 or the 5 fast things that you need to know. It's like a quick read you get in the morning. You can go back and you can look at what they've sent you every single day. They're going to aggregate and put together some of the most beautiful understanding educational components that you need to go through if you're considering stepping into alternative therapy or what have you, or if you're getting into the business of mushrooms. It's big business. It's huge business. $10.75 billion business by the year 2027. So dailymushroom.co, go join that newsletter and community and go and check out my friends at momentmushrooms.com. So without further ado, our guest today, I've chased this guy around for probably about 3 weeks, maybe 4. And, one day we're like, yeah, we're going to do a podcast. The next day we're not. And the reason why I chased him around is because he sees the forest through the weirdo Bitcoin authoritarian trees, the things that frustrate everybody. Dave Troy, investigative journalist out of Baltimore, Maryland. He's an investigative journalist, tech journalist, historic guy for the Washington Spectator. He's got a podcast called Dave Troy Presents. He's got a blog at Medium. He's got an incredible mailing list if you want to learn. He's been addressing threats to democracy for a really, really long time. His background as a technologist and a student of history gives him a very unique perspective on current life events. His newsletter is incredible. I encourage you to go sign up for it, davetroy.com. And I wanted Dave to come in today to talk to us about a bunch of different stuff. One of the things that was really important to me is to understand the connection between the far right, MAGA, conservatives, Putin, all the authoritarian parties and products, and their connection to Bitcoin. Why? What is the goal? What is the idea? Is it to conduct illegality? Is it because they want to replace the reserve? What's the reason? Why do we see every single far-right troll and Bitcoin account pandering for gold and precious metals? And so Dave joined me to talk about that and much, much more. So without further ado, please welcome to the podcast today, which you can get anywhere you get your fine podcasts, Crier Media YouTube channel. You can go to Apple. You can go to Spotify as well. You can download this yourself and listen to it when you want. It's the beautiful fucking part of On Demand. Please welcome to the program, Mr. Dave Troy. Troy, this has been a long time coming. I'm really excited to have you on. Investigative journalist, tech entrepreneur, disinformation researcher. You're out of Baltimore, Maryland. I have followed you for probably about 1 year to 2 years. Some people that say things that are a lot brighter than you, that have an experience in an education in a space like you do in a time like this, I find fascinating, right? Tech history. Those are your two areas of expertise. So I feel like you're uniquely qualified to speak to a bunch of different stuff that we're going through right now. What are we, like 17, 18 days away from a U.S. election? We've got a Canadian election that's coming up this year. You've got democracy versus authoritarianism. You've got Elon Musk running away with Donald Trump. You have India and Russia vying for conservative affection here in Canada. We've got Jordan Peterson and Tucker Carlson being accused of being Russian agents, paid Russian agents by the Prime Minister. So I'm really excited to have you on the show today. But I want to deal with something before we get there. I just read that you started and founded your first business at the age of 14. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, I've been in the tech world for a long time. So, when I was coming of age, it was the beginning of the personal computer industry. So I started, selling computers and software and built that up into a, pretty sizable business while I was in school. And then while I was in college, the internet happened. So I got involved with the internet industry and spent, a couple decades in that world. And, since then have been involved in kind of both tech and also journalism and writing and research and stuff like that. So yeah, it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, you've done a ton of work, and I obviously because I follow you, I listen to your podcast. It's called Dave Troy Presents. Everybody should go and download or subscribe to your podcast, which is incredible. You just did, I think, a bit with a gentleman named Gore from Opus Dei.
Yeah,
he did a big.
Gore.
Yeah, I haven't listened on that. Dude, I follow him now, and he's one of the guys that really broke that Opus Dei thing open in Argentina, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that's right.
So if anybody needs to understand anything or wants to have something that's really difficult to understand in the world of disinformation, tech, history, how the confluence of what's going on now between the left and the right, between, authoritarianism and democracy, Dave is one of the great follows that you can have in your life. That he will give you great information, and it's unvarnished. And I think the last time you and I we've been threatening to do this podcast. Last time we threatened to do this podcast, it was because of Elon Musk. And I want to get to Elon Musk in just a second. But since then, you've commented on a couple of posts and some stuff that's going on in Canada, specifically this Indian interference, murder for hire plot that's transnational. The FBI arrested someone yesterday or they put out an arrest warrant for a gentleman yesterday saying, hey, this is all part of it. This is your tweet. And I want to get to it right now. And we'll jump off here. What is it, India, with all the wet ops these days? You guys taking an online course from the FSB or something? Of course, this is in reference to Trudeau giving testimony that India indeed is meddling and indeed is killing Canadians on Canadian soil, threatening, extorting them, running around, sending information back. Indeed, it is state-run by Modi and Amit Shah, I believe his right-hand guy. And this is not Five Eyes are all over this. The UK is all over this. But I want your take on it because it fits into a much larger plan, Dave.
Well, I think, what we kind of have to look at with this is, this really broader global situation with, warfare against Western democracies. So it's all of the democracies. It's the US, it's Canada, it's the European democracies. And, it seems as though, there's at least, some alignment between Russia, China, India. There's notional talk of this BRICS bloc, and they're trying to do a currency. And whether that succeeds exactly is one thing. But the point is that they're trying and they're pushing kind of all at the same time. Somebody, I think it was Fiona Hill, said it's like everything everywhere all at once, and that's kind of what's happening. And so, I think if you think about Western democracies as kind of information processing machines, which they are to an extent. Like we get information in about what's happening in the world, and then we think about them and we do democratic things to react to them and whatnot. When you get so much information coming in at you so quickly, it becomes difficult to process it, and your capacity for sense making becomes overwhelmed. So, what I think we're kind of seeing right now is, Russia is ramping up its efforts. India seems to, it would be bold. Like, I've talked to a lot of people about whether, Russia would explicitly kill Americans, say, on American soil. And the overall consensus is, they generally don't want to do that because it's messy and it creates, attention and causes problems. Now, they've been known to kill Russians on Russian soil, and they've been known, obviously, to kill, in cases like Sergei Skripal and whatnot, they killed UK citizens on UK soil. But Americans on American soil has kind of been one of these red lines. So, the idea that India is pursuing these kinds of, wet operations in Canada and the US and whatnot is pretty remarkable overall in the scheme of things. And then that kind of raises the question of, like, does this give China or anybody else permission to start doing these sorts of things? It kind of makes you realize that we're a little bit exposed because the norms that we've been kind of operating under maybe are shifting. So when you think that, like, all of these countries are starting to become loosely aligned. I heard somebody the other day refer to a different kind of axis of alliance called CRINCS, which would be China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, like that block. And we see that now, coming together in sort of full fruition. When you have these countries all around the world starting to align themselves against Western democracies and against Western values, it's a dangerous situation, and one in which I think we're not generally prepared to kind of understand what's coming next with that. So I think we're at a reckoning point where we need to start to think about this a little bit differently.
Well, and thinking to your point, getting your common sense overwhelmed, you don't know where to start because it's coming from everywhere if you're in media, right? And if you're just someone who's consuming this on a recreational level where you're like, I'm going to check into Twitter, I'm going to go over to Facebook, see what's going on in the world. You are not just inundated, it's literally a fire hose. I mean, you do work in social media. You've really kind of centered a lot of work since 2007 is where you really started to kind of try to understand what social media is as part of the broader picture.
Right.
Being able to understand how all of these countries and their people are connected is very, very, very difficult for people. They just assume, right? Because people in other countries from these organizations that are aligned, whether it be CRINCS, whether it be, MAGA, doesn't matter who it is. If you repeat it enough, and if enough people are doing it, it carries this weight to it where you're like, maybe India should be allowed to murder Canadians on Canadian soil. Maybe India was just trying to get a Khalistani terrorist off the mean streets of Vancouver. Maybe, this whole thing that happened in the United States with the DOJ and Russian disinformation, maybe Russia has a right. Like, it literally makes you think things that are so out of the ordinary and so out of the norm that you start wondering if there's something fucking wrong with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes you question your assumptions, and I think that's indeed the point. I think one thing that I see quite often is that when you really get into the mindset of where these people are coming from, and let's say getting into, like, the Russian mindset, because that's probably where I spend most of my time when I'm thinking about, another point of view. Yeah, no, and it's just the nature of the beast, But the way they see the world is very much as being kind of persecuted. They see the West as kind of this devilish entity that's trying to sideline and, shame Russia and all of this. And so they end up taking on this very kind of paranoid, reactionary worldview. And, when you start to properly understand kind of where they're coming from, you can start to predict kind of like what their moves are and stuff. And, when you start to square or try to square the way they see the world with the way that Westerners see the world, which is very institution driven, very much, rooted in ideas about democracy and systems and laws, and, people are going to get prosecuted. And it's like, it really sort of is immaterial a lot of times, in terms of the way that, these foreign adversaries think. And so we have a tremendous problem where we can't really properly deter the foreign adversaries because we're projecting our own Western mindset onto the way that they presumably would think. And they do not think that way. They just don't, And so when you start to understand that, say, somebody like Putin's worldview is a mix of, like, sort of a cynical pragmatism combined with, mysticism of multiple different kinds, of kind of pseudoscience, of weird advisors, it helps you to understand they just don't think the way that we think they do. And That's a lesson that I think many in the West really need to kind of internalize right now, is we're up against folks who think extremely differently from us.
Yeah, well, and this is something that I think people need to be educated on. It's, and I've had a buddy of mine who's in Ukraine. His name is Alex Derebekov. He's an ICC investigator. He's been on with us numerous times, and trying to get, he tries to explain to us, Westerners, the difference in thinking between Russians and the rest of the world, right? Because they have been not marginalized, but they've been kettled into thinking a certain way, like every culture has.
Sure.
And so, and I get that, right? I get it. And where I find that interesting is that, it really kind of aligns with the problems that we see in North America right now, right? Is you've got religious interests, cultural interests in Canada fighting each other. You got atheists fighting extremists. You've got Christians and Muslims lining up together for the first time in history to fight against the devil, which is, godlessness, which is heathenistic, which is going to turn all your kids gay, that kind of stuff. I've never seen so many different cultures and religions who traditionally have spent a couple millennia trying to wipe each other out get together behind the idea that if atheism or secularism is allowed to continue to prosper, we're going to lose something. And and to me, that's the unwrapping that I've been trying to do, which is, okay, how is India, Russia, North Korea, China, where is the dot? Where's the straight line that goes between each country into Western countries that gets our thinkers who have been taught to, we've been brought up to think, in terms of common sense. We're not very religious. We're how have they been able to affect so many people in North America? This is and I get it's the repetition, and I get it's the attachment to core beliefs. I find it absolutely amazing. It's like the upside down world in 2024, according to the life that I grew up living.
Well, yeah. And, I think part of it is that, we tend to look at history, certainly contemporary history, through a lens of things that have happened in the last, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, our lifetimes roughly. Mm-hmm. And, that's a very reasonable lens. And I think there's things you can learn from looking at that kind of an arc. But I think you kind of need to zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture of the arc of broader history. So if you zoom out to, say, a 100-year window and look at the last 100 years, what was the big thing that's happened in the last 100 years? Well, the rise and fall of communism was certainly a huge one. Obviously, also the world wars and subsequent conflicts that have sort of fell out of that. But, let's just even look at, the rise and fall of communism.
Yeah.
So what happened there? Well, Russia went through some gyrations. They lost their monarchy and got taken over by communists. Okay. So, that conflict generated kind of two spheres of influence, one which was the sort of Bolshevik sphere, and the other was sort of the leftover white Russian sphere of monarchists and royalists and whatnot, and who effectively became the core of the anti-communist movement over the course of the 20th century. So what we're basically dealing with now is the blowback from 1917. That's one part of it. Now, if you take that and sort of put that, on the shelf, and then look at some other things that have been going on culturally, there's also things like Vatican II in the Catholic Church, which greatly liberalized the Catholic Church. It took away the notion of the Latin Mass as being the default, and it did Mass in local languages, and liberalized the church in very important ways. And of course, along with that, you have things like abortion and, increasing Catholic approval for abortion and whatnot. So you have this strain of traditionalism that, has been under assault, let's say, for the last, 100 years, where things went from being, very traditional to, in the 60s, it was really the unraveling of mainstream traditionalism, if you will. So, and of course, along with that came a lot of other good things, rights expansion for, people of color and for women and all sorts of other things accompanied this. But, for the traditionalists, they see this as an unraveling of what they thought was a good thing. Now, why would the traditionalists have thought that that was a good thing? Well, because, it created this kind of hierarchical, patriarchal society that they thought offered some benefits.
Mhm.
What were those benefits? Well, cultural distinction, national. I mean, there were a whole bunch of other different things that you can, look at that accompany traditionalism. But at any rate, if you look at the last, 100 years or so, as being kind of a interweaving of these two threads of communism versus anti-communism and traditionalism versus more liberalism. um, you could see how we would be in a position of kind of backlash at the moment. And so the notion that we're sort of seeing the backlash against, let's say, socialism, and the backlash against cultural liberalism happening at the same time, kind of not that surprising. It's kind of timed up. And so what's happening is that the people who can benefit from these cultural trends that are just there are helping to try to shape them as well as to try to harness them. So to the extent possible, there's been an effort to synchronize these anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-liberal kind of movements all at the same time, everything everywhere all at once in multiple countries, such that we end up with kind of a wave that is unstoppable. And of course, if you're a Putin, or if you're a Xi, or if you're an Elon Musk, or anybody else that feels like that they would benefit from this wave, you're going to join in, right? You're going to try to do what you can to push this, because at the end of the day, it's very difficult to take over.
Do they live in that wake, though? Do they live in the wake of that movement, or is it an organized movement? Like,
I think it's a dialogue. I think there's some organization behind some aspects of it. So if you look at organizations like the World Congress of Families, which is a Russian-American organization that has been around for like 30 years, they very much set out to organize the whole idea was to connect American evangelicals with the Orthodox Christians, specifically the Russian Orthodox Church, which is connected to the FSB, which is connected to Putin in Russia, starting in the 90s. And so like there are some distinct efforts to sort of lay what you might consider the skeleton of this creature, but there's also a lot of just kind of organic people buying into it. I mean, think about all the sort of I don't know, you could call them useful idiots, or just people that are joiners or hangers on that hop onto these movements, that do it because that appeals to them, or they feel like they have something they can gain from it.
Shared values, right? They're usually attached to some core belief. That's where you see it attach itself here, right?
Sometimes it's just people making money online because they can, it's conflict entrepreneurs of various kinds. I mean, so it takes all kinds, you bring all sorts of it's a big tent kind of phenomenon where all sorts of people can join in, and then the product is whatever the product is. And, if we end up in a position where, we end up with a big wave of traditionalism because all of these waves have, joined together and synchronized and gotten really large in amplitude, then, that's the way things are going to go. And so I think, the challenge is, if we don't want things to go that way, you have to act as a wave interrupter and figure out where the control points are that are injecting energy into these waves. And to the extent that there is centralized coordination, attack those and disrupt them so that they can't keep doing what they're doing. So in that case, if it's, disinformation actors acting in bad faith to achieve outcomes for political means, then charge them with something if you can. That will disrupt them, that will put them in jail for a while, it will make things harder for them to do that. And my overall thesis, and I think a lot of people would agree with this, is that much of this attempt to generate this kind of backlash is not, in fact, organic. I think there's an attempt to make it appear organic, but I don't think it is, in fact, organic. And I think that if a lot of these disinformation actors were disrupted sooner, then we would see less of this stuff happening. Because at the end of the day, most people are not up all night worried about ideological things. They want to have a stable family life. They want to be able to get an education, have a job, raise a family, have some nice vacations. and live a nice retirement. That is what most people kind of want.
It's the
They're
dream,
not
Dave. You just
cultural
described the
warriors.
dream right there.
I mean, that's it. That's all anybody really wants. And, the idea that we all have to enter into this cultural warfare is just crazy. So, I think if there was less of this stuff going on that was inorganic, we would see less of it that was organic. And
How
and
much
that
of it-
would
let me-
allow democracy to function. And it's
let me-
not functioning right now.
No, it's not, and it's not functional under the auspices of an augmented reality. Like that's the thing that I keep telling
Yeah.
people, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I've had people come into my timeline or into my DMs because my DMs are open. I shouldn't have done it, but I did it. Have come in my DMs to try to augment my well-researched findings or my reality, or augment the well-researched findings of doctors and experts, where they want to tell you how it works. And again, you go back to it, you do it enough, right? You do it enough, you get after it enough, you start to question yourself. And I want to kind of jump off there. I want to get to Canada in just a second. Elon's role in this is fascinating. You've been all over it. He jumped into the foray recently, going to a couple of rallies wearing his MAGA hats. He absolutely unlisted the block button yesterday, said that he's going to do away with the block button. You might not be able to interact with some of the tweets, but bottom line is it's a stalker's paradise. Jim Stewartson called it, 16 chan, I believe, the other day. And I thought, oh, that's a pretty good take on it. Was this always the goal? Was it to platform in your mind to help with augmenting that reality by platforming these people who have been removed from that platform? Why are we seeing right now, in your opinion, and I want your take, why Elon purchased Twitter?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I, was studying this stuff very, very, very closely back in like 2020. And it was becoming clear then, certainly during the pandemic, that Elon was leaning in this direction. And I had a strong sense in, mid 2020 that he was going to come out to be a problem of some kind, but it wasn't entirely clear exactly what arc he was going to take. And so, he was just sort of on the watch list. And as 2021 and 2022 unfolded, it became clear that he was basically going to come out in full support of this kind of Putinist Trump, global agenda. And, I warned people about it in 2020 and 2021, people high up in the US government, and, wrote up some things that outlined what we were seeing. And, at the time, it was mostly kind of, okay, thanks for the info. But people didn't take it too seriously because, it didn't seem like he was doing much more than just sort of putting out memes, But it was clear to me from his network alignments and who he was connected with and the arc of it, that just where it was going. So I was present in the room at TED 2022, which was in Vancouver, by the way, when Musk made the announcement that he was going to purchase Twitter. And, so I saw that all firsthand and unfold. And, I knew then that it was going to be a huge problem. And a lot of people were kind of naive about it. Like, oh, he'll, annoy the left and the right equally. It'll be fine. It's good. Free speech.
I believe he
whatever.
even said that, right? Like he said that when he bought it. Yeah. He's like, hey,
he said all that explicitly.
We need to be neutral. We need to go after the left and the right equally. Well, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So he was, going on about that. And I think some people took him at face value. But because I had been seeing the arc that he was on coming together, I was like, nope, this is going to end poorly. I don't know how it's going to play out exactly, but watch this space. This is how this is going to go. It's going to be bad. And sure enough, it just he keeps cranking the knob up further and further to kind of make things as extreme as possible. And of course, where he first started saying these kinds of, equivocal things that were sort of equanimous, now he's, starting to come out, in a very full-throated way, not only for Donald Trump, but for he's like dark MAGA. And, he's just, and I posted something about this morning. He has created a corporation in Texas called the United States of America, Inc., where he is the sole director. What is he going to do with that? I don't know, but I personally believe that he's going to start playing around with this Texit concept, which is also connected to the same network and which would serve Putin's interests.
Yeah, it's Brexit. It's Brexit or Wexit, but it's in Texas.
Texas,
and
yep.
they don't give them creativity points there, Dave, because they keep going with the same exit plan with everything that they do. But
Yeah.
to your point, I think, greasing the tracks. And I saw your tweet this morning, and I thought about it. I wonder if he's greasing the tracks for losing the election and then retreating to Texas full time, where they turn that into their own republic.
Yeah, I think what they're doing is kind of laying out some potential scenarios depending on how the election goes. So, like if Trump wins, it's pretty clear that, they're going to try to gut as much of the U.S. government as possible. I mean, they've already made that explicit. The Project 2025 agenda is that Musk is talking about becoming, doing something, that he's calling the Department of Government Efficiency, or Doge, which is a reference to his silly crypto coin. And Trump is fully on board. And what's crazy is the degree to which Trump is on Elon's leash at this point. 4 years ago, Trump was sort of, not real up on Elon. He thought he was kind of a nut job.
Yeah, he tweeted that Elon should bend the knee like everybody else. Yeah,
he was very, very much, kind of talking down about Musk. But now, he's basically just like, oh, no, Musk is going to run the government efficiency stuff and cut all the jobs. So, I think you would easily see NATO under attack. You would see, pretty much all other, a lot of federal initiatives come under attack. Sure. Is there room for government efficiency improvements? Yes, obviously. But, at the same time, like the provisions of the Schedule F stuff under Project 2025 really are talking about making just wholesale firings across the entire federal government. And really, not so much based on based on what makes sense or what would be good for the public. It's more like what's in the way of big business and, what's
in our way,
like to see.
Right?
Yeah, what's in their way. Yeah. So I think that's sort of plan A. Plan B, I would see maybe there's 3 plans, A, B, and C. So, plan A would be they win and they do a bunch of stuff and it gets crazy and whatever. They go down that road. The plan B would be they lose, but it's real close. And so they, do a bunch of election challenging stuff that could lead to unrest and problems, between now and, January 6th, January 20th. And the other question that's in that scenario is who wins the control of the Congress, which is kind of up in the air. We don't really know for sure how that's going to play out. So, there's some variability there. And then the third scenario would be that they lose and lose hard, in which case, a thing you could do would basically be to, retreat to Texas, pair up with Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton, both of whom Musk has a tight relationship with, and start making noise about Texas secession. Or even, if you really want to just be ballsy, just like declare Texas secession and see what happens. Like people are all like, well, wouldn't you have to vote or something? And I'm like, maybe, if you're going to go down this road, why follow a constitution?
Well, and I feel like we live in that time where billionaires can claim states as an asset. Like I really do. I feel like we live in a time where at any point in time, a guy like Elon Musk can go, you know what? I just bought Oregon, right?
Yeah, it's a little silly, and I agree that there are like potential barriers in the way to this for sure. But if you want to just talk about the sort of thing that you could do, you could basically pair up with Abbott and say, unless our demands are met, whatever the demands are, we're going to, Texas is going to I'm going to put out as an executive order. Let's say you're Greg Abbott. I'm going to put out an executive order declaring secession from the United States for Texas. You could do that, right? There's nothing stopping anybody from writing such a statement. Now, whether it's legally binding or what it means, that's a whole nother can of worms. But if he did that, and then Putin says, we support Texas's secession from the United States.
Yeah.
And we're allied with Texas. Like, okay, that's interesting. So then you start going down that path. Then let's say people start moving to Texas because they want to be part of this great movement. And let's say that they bring their guns and, God knows what else. And you can see where this might go.
Probably their dogs, their horses, their belt buckles.
The
right?
whole deal. It's going to be a
Yeah.
whole thing. And of course, it would be a media circus and there would be all kinds of drama about it. And,
What if they be like caravans back in like in the early 1800s is when the land claims stuff happened, like caravans of people heading down there.
It would suck up all the oxygen. Any inbound administration would be able to do nothing but this because it would be such a circus. You'd have still whatever's going on in Ukraine and the Middle East and potentially Asia happening. So you basically open up a fourth domestic front that would threaten the structural integrity of the United States. So then suppose you live with that for 3 months. And then, I don't know, maybe Florida says, yeah, you know what? We're going to join in with Texas. We stand with Texas, and so I know it's a crazy scenario and it's nuts and everything. But in terms of like thinking the way the Russians think, this is what they're thinking about. And to the extent that Elon is acting as a projector of what Russia thinks,
sure,
then you have to worry about this. Now, again, maybe it doesn't happen, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't plan for it or you shouldn't be thinking that it's a possibility, because it's a definite possibility. Now, granted, the plans that I just laid out, A, B, and C, it is decidedly plan C. I don't really think that they would pursue it in the other two cases, probably, but it's always kind of going to be there as like a thing on the table if they feel like that they need it, So I think it's just something you have to put on the wargaming board as a possibility.
Fascinating. We have a Texas in Canada. It's called Alberta. I don't know if you're familiar with Alberta.
Very familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see any parallels with, because there's, just to give you some backstory, and I know you're really familiar with Alberta and Canada disinformation, what has gone into it, but very oil rich, a lot like Texas. They've got a very high end conspiracy conservative government, the UCP. They're, the other day, the premier of of Alberta was talking about chemtrails, and maybe the U.S. government is spraying some mind control chemtrails in southern Alberta. She was soundly mocked by the Pentagon and U.S. officials right after that. Now they're talking about Wexit, right, which is the West exiting Canada. So Texit, Wexit, again, don't give them points for creativity. We're talking about disinformation. We're talking about the same players, but we're also talking about really parallel courses for the state of Texas and Alberta. Do you see any similarities in what's gone into, and what are the variables that go into? Because, man, if they're on the same track, they've got to have the same assholes behind the scenes pulling the same strings, in my mind.
Yeah, I'd say they're roughly on the same parallel tracks. I haven't studied the degree to which Russia has been directly involved in Alberta, but I do know that like things like the Atlas Network, have been active in terms of the oil and gas interests in Alberta, and folks like Ezra Levant with Rebel News are associated with Atlas Network. And I would make the statement that, broadly speaking, a lot of kind of the libertarian, anarcho-capitalist impulses that are appearing in Canada are a product of that kind of Alberta oil and gas interest kind of networks. That's consistent with everything that I've learned from talking to folks in Canada. And again, Canada is not my primary area of study, but just every time that I come across anything Canadian, it plugs into that overall thing. The other thing you have going on out in that part of Canada is the whole thing with Ramana Didulo, the crazy Filipino sovereign citizen lady. And on the one hand,
she took over a whole town in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, no, it's nuts. But on the one hand, I think she's like literally probably crazy. But I also think that like those kinds of movements serve the purposes of this kind of broader geopolitical game. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all that if that movement was getting support from, say, Russia through like a proxy. And again, I don't know that there's an easy way to get to the bottom of that right now, but I would suspect that would be part of this broader set of plays. So, and again, Polyev, very much, sort
Oh,
of
you're familiar
representing.
with Pierre Poilievre.
Oh, I've been
What do you know?
following him since he came on the scene. And what was startling about him was that he was being promoted by all of the same, sort of right-wing disinformation networks that were, taking action in the United States. So, he is part of that. And what I'm surprised by, and I guess, we talked a little bit about this before the show, but a lot of people, when I bring this stuff up about Canada, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're talking about this because nobody in Canada and the media is talking about it, and I'm like, well, it's obvious to anybody that's paying attention. I mean, if you've been following the space the last 3 years, who Polyev is,
So who
it's
is he to
interesting.
you? How would you explain, being a tech expert, disinformation researcher, someone who understands, and I want to know what the Atlas Network is. I hope we can get a quick explanation of that for people. And we'll connect some dots between Ezra Levant, Alberta, Atlas Network, and Pierre Poilievre. But what do you know about Pierre Poilievre? How would you describe him to somebody if you're going to describe players on the international scene who are stumping for authoritarian values?
Well, so you have to look at this from the standpoint of sort of libertarian, anarcho-capitalist values. So if you, I wrote a really long piece about this about 2 years ago that's pretty definitive, called Paranoia on Parade, which you can Google. And basically, this is when I talk about relitigating, socialism versus.
Yeah, that was about J6, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, it
Yeah,
sort
it
of
was
culminated with J6, but
Yeah.
it gets at a lot of this history too. The other thing that's underneath all of this is the New Deal and the gold standard. So basically, in order to implement the New Deal, it was necessary to end the gold standard, which, for those that don't know, this was the idea that you could take your paper currency and trade it in for a fixed amount of gold.
Mhm.
And, to make a very long story short, in order to enact the New Deal in the United States, it was necessary to create a lot of money in this, monetary supply in order to pay everybody, as part of these government programs that really were the New Deal, all of these 3-letter programs. So, and there's a big historical argument about whether the New Deal was good or bad or whatever, but it was there, it happened. And in order to make it work, they had to kind of dial back on the gold standard, because the concern was that if everybody turned in all of the paper dollars that were in circulation, you would wipe out the gold reserves. And so it was part of a whole series of moves to really kind of create monetary supply. And, of course, that led to the New Deal happening and working. And, then, of course, we ended up in World War II, which, of course, fueled way more recovery than probably anything else. But that all said, there became a existential kind of rift between people that thought that the New Deal was good and people that thought that the New Deal was bad. The people that thought that the New Deal was bad really felt as though going off of the gold standard was a mistake. And part of this was because they didn't really feel like that the Federal Reserve central banking system was fundamentally legitimate. And that's sort of the best case. The worst case is that they thought it was a massive, Jewish conspiracy controlled by the Rothschilds and everything else. And
The
so
Gettys, probably Colonel Sanders. Yeah.
Mostly the Jewish bankers from Europe, and JP Morgan and all that. So,
Yeah.
There's a whole corpus of conspiracy literature that originated around the idea that the Federal Reserve was a huge evil conspiracy. And so we're dealing with that now. And so when I talk about the Atlas Network or whatever, basically there's all of these networks of right libertarian anarcho-capitalist folks that got spawned over the last 75 years or so in particular, that are rooted in that idea that the New Deal is bad and that the gold standard should be returned. So the Atlas Network believes that. And the reason it's called Atlas is because it's after the Ayn Rand novel Atlas Shrugged, which was one of the key fictional texts that sort of crystallized a lot of these worldviews into a fictional narrative, but not a very good one, in fact. So like Rand Paul is named after Ayn Rand, and that's he's part of this network, as is his father, is Ron Paul, senator from Kentucky, very much part of this whole worldview.
Who else? Anybody else that I would know be part of that group? The Koch brothers?
Oh, I mean, certainly Peter Thiel, Koch, Musk. I mean, all of these guys, everybody that's a problem right now, and pushing these kinds of anti-democratic views is part of that general worldview.
Still pissed over a 75-year-old deal. That's what I find of
Yeah, well, I mean, it's basically like, if you think about what the New Deal kind of led to, they believe that it led to this kind of like, socialists, social safety net, kind of wishy-washy society that, it made it difficult for meritocracy to take hold. Now, what do they mean by meritocracy? Another word for meritocracy might be hierarchy. And if you think that you are deserving of accumulation of all the wealth because it's a signal of how great you are, then you're going to be opposed to things that redistribute resources away from a hierarchical distribution. So that's a lot of what we're dealing with right now is sort of hierarchy versus a more, the flattening effects of democracy.
So to a guy like Elon Musk, he's thinking, hey, I made it. I'm a quadrillionaire. I should be allowed to kind of push my weight around. This is what I should be allowed to do. I am worth more than almost every world government. I should be allowed to act like one at that point.
Right. Now, you have to temper that with the fact that, Musk is sort of a made man. Like he's been able to gain a lot of his wealth through government subsidies, but also, and then this is the thing that people don't generally look at, is that, the whole point of SpaceX was to privatize aspects of the space program and realize cost savings, which in fact it's done. I mean, you really can't argue with their ability to realize cost savings. It's been tremendous. But do you know who wrote the enabling legislation that made SpaceX possible?
I'm going to say Dana Rohrabacher.
That is correct.
There you go.
It's Dana Rohrabacher for 500. So
who I believe was seen at J6 wearing a toque, running around trying to take over the government, if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds right. Yeah. So, and he, has been described repeatedly as Putin's favorite congressperson.
Yeah.
Now, if you actually follow back Dana Rohrabacher's history, he got involved in these anti-communist things in like 1967 as a student visiting Czechoslovakia, and it might sound counterintuitive, like, oh, well, he was in a, left bloc place, or Eastern bloc place, and wouldn't he have been pulled into communism? No, in fact, he got pulled into the anti-communist networks. So if you look at, say, Putin as being a manifestation of the anti-communist networks, because the thing about like the KGB was that while the KGB was serving sort of the communist regime, ostensibly, yeah, sure, it was pushing the communist regime's agenda and, a left-leaning point of view. But when the Soviet Union fell, it's basically didn't go away. It turned into, the KGB turned into the FSB, but the FSB remained in service of Soviet, or really of Russian state power. Mm-hmm. And certainly Putin, being a creature of the FSB, formerly the KGB, he didn't let that drop. So basically the KGB went from being in service of the Politburo's agenda to being in the service of the anti-communist network's agenda. Because if you think about the failure of the Soviet Union as the triumph of the White Russians over the Bolsheviks, which, is a way to read it. I'm not sure everybody would read it that way, but that's a way to read it. Then you can basically see the KGB becoming in service of anti-communism. And, that's why we see all this alignment, in addition to all the traditionalist stuff that's pragmatically useful for Putin, sort of cynically so, because I don't really think Putin is, much of a traditionalist, but, it serves his interest. So, that's sort of how we ended up here, and the Canadian stuff just falls right into it. So Atlas Network.
How does Pierre fit into that then?
So he's, effectively the Canadian representative of that worldview, of the New Deal was bad. We need to be on hard currency. He's spoken out very vocally in favor of like Bitcoin. I don't know that he's, advocating for the return to the gold standard exactly, but I guarantee you that, he would be in favor of things like Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, for those that don't know, it tries really hard to mirror gold, not because you have a physical asset that, you can look at and it's pretty, but because there's a limited quantity of Bitcoin. So the reason why gold bugs, as we call them, are obsessed with gold is because it's scarce. And the reason why Bitcoin people are obsessed with Bitcoin is because it's scarce. So it shares that property. So, there's rough alignment between folks that are into Bitcoin and people that are into gold. They have little internecine arguments between themselves about which one's better. But broadly speaking, it's a very similar worldview. And both of those communities object to like the New Deal and central banking. So, Putin.
You know what makes more sense right now as you're explaining this to me? Because they're trying to destroy the monetary, right? They're trying to destroy the dollar. They're trying to destroy fiat currency.
Correct. Yeah, they're anti-fiat currency.
But what makes more sense to me now, as you're explaining this, in a lighter note, on a lighter note, are all of the people who, all the bots, all the trolls, all the fake accounts in their bios that have precious metals hashtags,
Yep,
along with Bitcoin hashtags.
yep.
Every single one of them. It is like, I would say 95% of the people or accounts that I get shitpost by from around the world all have laser eyes,
Yep.
ETF, BTC, precious metals, gold, all of them.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, in a large sense, that's what this is about. And I didn't really land on that as being the case until, I guess, right around the time of January 6th is kind of when I realized, like, oh, this is about the gold standard. Like, oh, I see now. Okay. So then once you understand that,
my mind is being blown right now, Dave.
It's as simple as this. Now, I mean, granted, these other things, socialism versus communism and traditionalism, they weave into it too.
They're vehicles, though, right? They're vehicles that they hide behind, like religion, the isms. Everybody uses an ism or an ideology, and they use it to gin people up, gas people up. While they're doing that, they're trying to devalue dollars, and they're trying to take over Federal Reserve and trying to tell everybody that their way of conducting business is going to be the only way of conducting business. And they can't do it because nobody's in office. And that's the run, right? That's the understanding that I have now.
Yeah, that's about right. And the other way to think of it is that, they believe strongly that this is the way the world should work. And in fact, they believe that the world does work this way. So when you get into these, conversations about inflation and what causes inflation, you will hear from them that it's because the government is printing money. Now, a more nuanced understanding might suggest that, when you have specific dollars chasing specific goods that are in short supply, that's when prices go up. You also have issues with monopoly, price control, and price gouging and things like that, which are real. I mean, like when two companies control the chicken supply for a country, they can make the price of chicken go up to serve their bottom line.
Telcos in Canada, like the exact same thing.
Same kind of thing. So, you can't get away from the fact that price gouging and monopoly price control are real. But point being, to your point about kind of getting into power, what they kind of want to do is to get into power enough to implement the world as they think it should be implemented. And that might mean by eliminating central banking in order to prove that, like, the way that they see the world is correct. And so it's an epistemological kind of existential, philosophical kind of conflict that we're dealing with here. And it literally is two totally irreconcilable worldviews. If you believe that central banking is basically okay and a social good and produces good outcomes for democracy, you can't take on this other point of view that gold and Bitcoin are the way to go, because they're incompatible. And the reason, and a lot of people, I think, for example, VP Harris gets this wrong right now, or at least is, allowing herself to be wrong about this for campaigning purposes, in that there's really no way for like Bitcoin and gold, buggery to coexist alongside, central banking. Like if you were to adopt cryptocurrency, Bitcoin at scale, it has network effects. And what's happening right now is that because it's scarce, the more people that adopt it, the more the price goes up, which gives people that hold Bitcoin more cash leverage over the entire political system. So I don't know if you followed this, but in this particular political cycle, there's been $120 million spent so far from the crypto industry on candidates from both the Republican and Democratic Party in the US, which is more than has been spent by oil and gas. So, I mean, this is a big deal. This is a big deal. And that's this cycle. If you wait until 2026 or 2028, it's pretty much a guarantee that all candidates will be kowtowing to the crypto industry if this is left unchecked. So, yeah, I should correct myself. I said earlier there was no way for gold to coexist. Gold has coexisted with this stuff for a long time, and it sits there and it does its thing, and the growth usually isn't very high. But the problem with Bitcoin is that, because of network effects and because of the way it works, it has the potential to capture the entire political system. And like, nobody's really thinking about that. And it's a huge problem. And, somebody like Polyev, would benefit from that tremendously, because it would mean that all across the entire political spectrum, you're talking about the leaders of each province, you're talking about the mayors of cities, could get captured by crypto interests, which in turn are compatible with oil and gas and whatnot. And, it's a way to take over the entire world. And there's a great video from Peter Thiel, which you could even include in here. It's about 10 seconds. Where he basically says that he sees cryptocurrency as a way to influence politics and take over government in ways that don't involve convincing people of your point of view or whatever. You just take over. And he calls it, quote, a great alternative to politics. So
yeah,
this is real.
I'll splice the video in, but he effectively, I think I've got it here. You tweeted it at August 17th, where he said technology is this incredible alternative to politics and a way to unilaterally change the world. And now he has allies, the former Christian nationalist Putin, Z, MBS, MBZ, all of whom think the dollar is evil, strangely all aligning on that side of the dictatorial equation, right?
Right.
We talk about meritocracies.
Polyev right there with him. So that's the issue, is that, Polyev by himself might be okay, but if you had, the capture of Canadian politics en masse by way of crypto interests, that's bad. And that's not outside of the realm of possibility,
Well, dude, you just tore a hole in the wall of this conversation, because, you see things, you notice things, and we're so focused on, the cultural outrage, the outrage porn, right? Of each one of these situations. Like right now in Canada, as you know, Pierre Poilievre does not have national security background clearance. He doesn't have it. He won't sit for it. He refuses to do it. We also are going through this incredible Indian affair where India has been accused of extrajudicial killings across the ocean, coming here, setting up shop, government-run murder for hire plots, extortion schemes, organizing. They have also been accused by all three levels of law enforcement in this country of working with the same people that set up that terror plot network in Canada, specifically in Vancouver. They've also been accused of helping him win the leadership race of the Conservative Party of Canada back 2 years ago after the convoy was going on. It's literally in the NSCOP paper. I'll send it to you. I'm sure you've read it. You might have. And again, we live in this world now where I don't know if any of that, I know why they're doing it now, and I get it. If India's goal is the same thing, and if we're talking about decentralizing and, our banking across the world, if India's goal is the same as Xi's goal, is the same as Putin's goal, is the same as MAGA's goal, is the same as Elon Musk's goal. But what we're kind of talking about now is that's all fodder, right? Those are all red herrings. The idea that you're going to connect with those groups through that content and through some of the gaslighting you're doing. But what you're saying really is this has everything to do with money and nothing to do with the other stuff.
Yeah, I think that, this is sort of what underlies it. And, it becomes very easy to, and I tell this to folks in the States too, it becomes very easy to get fixated on, the religious groups that are brought into this, evangelical groups and, the New Apostolic Reformation and Opus Dei and whoever else. And, the concern that you have is that, they're trying to enact a theocracy or something, capture the United States for the purposes of theocracy. And, some of them want to do that. But at the same time, like, that isn't really what this is about ultimately. And, if you look at like somebody like Musk, does he want a theocracy? No, he doesn't care anything at all about a theocracy. He's interested in the monetary,
But he plays like he
policy
does.
aspects.
But he plays like he does.
He's not going to turn off those people. The way you have to understand large factions of people is as a kind of technology. I mean, basically, religions are a kind of a cult, and cults are ways to manipulate large chunks of society. All you need is a bunch of people that are bound to each other through some kind of, social capital links that, bring them together in some shared project or identity.
A bunch of different isms. Yeah. Can you connect with the isms, right?
Yeah. Well, again, are people devoted to each other in some way, right? Whether it's around ideology or worldview or, doctrine, what have you, as long as they're sufficiently, it's, like you have a choice. You can either go out and try to poke individual people and get them to do what you want, or you can grab onto the biggest chunks that exist in society. So these chunks of people, these factions, are basically a technology for manipulating large chunks of people at once. And if you follow third world, I shouldn't use that term, but if you follow, elections in other parts of the world, like in the Philippines and stuff, there's a couple of three big organizations, religious organizations that form big voting blocks for, people running for president and stuff. So, there's the Catholic Church, and then there's a couple of other large cultish churches behind them. And they just worry about lining up those votes. Granted, there's probably a bunch of other people that are, the swing voters. But if you think about, like factions as being kind of like states or swing states or something, you need to attach yourself to those so that you get those, outcomes. And, then everything else is sort of down on the long tail. And so, I think that people misread these kinds of religious and, sort of cultural warfare things as being strictly about the subject matter. It's not really about that. It's more about how do you get a hook into these groups of people to get the outcomes that the people at the very top of the power equation actually want to achieve. And that's what I see with like Musk manipulating the Christians.
So just tools, right? And it's an act. And behind that act and behind those tools and behind those factions and those groups is a cabal of people who want to install a financial meritocracy, not based on the New Deal, based on the gold standard.
More or less, yeah. And that's as a reactionary response to, 100 years of New Deal, which people, some people are upset about. And, and I think when you talk about sort of, a cabal or whatever, I think you run the risk of, getting into conspiracy or whatever. But I think that at the same time, it is fair to say that there's a relatively modest number of people that have the means to affect these kinds of outcomes, and they are talking to each other. They may not all agree. They probably haven't signed some piece of paper where in blood that they're going to do X, Y, or Z. Like, I don't think it requires any kind of complex conspiracy thinking to realize that there's just a bunch of people who kind of think the same way, and they all have this kind of masters of the universe worldview that like they think that they're super special because they have a lot of money and power, and they want to affect outcomes that they think will benefit not only themselves, but they may even believe that they're benefiting humanity. Like, I don't think that Musk is actually probably lying when he says that what he's doing is to benefit humanity. I think he thinks that. But at the same time, I don't think that in a democracy decisions should be made by one dude with like exceptional resources to like control outcomes. And I think it's also worth pointing out that somebody like Musk, he's a very high agency person. He is somebody that when he makes a decision to get something done, there's a pretty good chance that some aspect of it is going to get done. Now, may he reach the ultimate goal that he's talking about? Often not, but I mean, he's catching rockets with robot arms. He's building electric cars.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive, wasn't it?
I mean, by any stretch of the imagination, that was a cool trick. Now, was it him or was it his team? Or, you can get into parsing all of that. But point being that by any reasonable measure, he and, Jeff Bezos and, Peter Thiel, these are high agency people that when they make a decision to do something, stuff happens. And to the extent that they believe that because they have that capability, whether that capability was one that they totally earned or was bestowed upon them by benefactors, I think it's a combination of both, they have it. And their thinking is, if we have this ability to affect outcomes, then we are going to do that. And that's what they're attempting to do. And I think you just kind of have to look at it through that lens. And, you know, to the extent that that's incompatible with democratic values, then you kind of, if you believe in democratic values, you're going to have to stand up and say, you know, I respect your agency. However, this is not okay. This is where it stops.
Yeah, at that point, that democracy that they tell you that you know, if they do win, that democracy, if all that power is accrued in the hands of just a couple of people with all the money, is no longer a democracy. To your point, last question I want to ask you: the organization up here in Canada, Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, runs IDU. Thoughts? Have you heard anything about the IDU?
I've heard mentions of, you know, what Harper's doing, and that I have not studied it, so I don't really have any informed comment on it, unfortunately.
All right. No, we'll just cut this question out of the podcast then.
Yeah, no worries. No worries.
But listen, Dave, I think a nice place to wrap up. Great summary of what's really going on around us. Really appreciate your insight, more than you know, because it scares me a little less. Right? Being able to sit down and talk to you about this, to kind of find out what this is all about, it scares me a little less, and I think it would scare a lot of other people a little less, just to hear that it's just a bunch of rich white dicks running around trying to get revenge for the New Deal that 75 years ago really upset their forefathers. Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of that. And when you do understand, you know, kind of the broader trends that are in play here, it does become a little bit more manageable. Like,
yeah,
at least you know what it's about. It's still really big and hard to solve, but at least you know why. And it's not just, you know, people trying to, you know, install a religious theocracy or, you know, I don't know, you know, do all what else. You know, it's not about
it's not just a mega cult, right? It's not just about Russia. It's not just about Indian terror networks. It's not all working together. I mean, it is about money.
It's about the idea of money, and it's not even about how much money. I mean, like, people are like, oh, well, you know, Trump is motivated by profit and Musk just wants to make more money, kind of. But really, you know, if you've ever known any really rich people, after people get a certain amount of money, it's not about getting more money, it's about power. And, you know, money's nice, but power is everything. And you know, at the end of the day, that's what this is about, is sort of who has power, who gets to decide the future of the world. I think, you know, if you look at Putin's worldview, he believes that American hegemony has, you know, continuously dealt Russia a bad deck of cards. And so they want to reset the playing field and, you know, have a different, you know, way forward for 100 years and see how that goes. And, you know, from that perspective, you can understand why they might feel that way. And, you know, to the extent that, you know, we want to create a better future, I think democracies need to do a better job of offering a clear alternative for what a democratic future for the world actually looks like. And so far, a lot of what we're doing is playing defense against authoritarians and autocrats, when we ought to be actually offering a very forward, you know, democracy forward, you know, vision for the world. And we kind of have not done a great job of that. So that's the next step.
Did progressives and academics miss that? Because on the right, they seem to be highly organized and seem to be working in unison, because you got like everybody on this side of the equation, that common sense centrist left side of the equation, progressive side of the equation, everybody's saying the same thing, but they're yelling it in different directions. On the right side of the equation, the libertarian side of the equation, they're all going in the same direction, saying the same things, tagging onto the same talking points that are highly Russian in nature, that are really psyops. If you're like, as you know, right, attaching core beliefs, all the other stuff, making people angry. The algorithm does the rest of the work. I find that fascinating. I really do.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, those folks on that side feel like that they've been under siege since like 1933. So when you're under siege for a long time, you get organized.
It's a lot of victims on that side. Then
there's a lot of that kind of thinking, but that's kind of where they're coming from. Is that, you know, their worldview has been underrepresented. So as a result, they've gotten very organized, and so we're up against this big wave of synchronized grievance, basically. And, at the end of the day, because of the very complicated history of the Cold War and the interactions with the Soviets and everything else, the left, as we like to call it, is caught a bit flat-footed because we haven't really thought about, what the future should be for democratic institutions. And I'll leave it with this. There was a really interesting book that was put forth in 1939 called Union Now by a guy named Clarence Strite, who offered a vision of what a democratic global future could look like. And he basically proposed a global union of 15 of the world's biggest democracies that would be similar to the United States Union was in 1789, but taking into account all these countries globally. And we're really recognizing the global nature of political reality and whatnot going forward in the 20th century. Book got a lot of traction. A lot of people were super interested in it. And there's a lot of intellectual discussion around it. But then World War II happened. The Cold War happened. And we've been spending the last 30 years in the wake of the Cold War dealing with the fallout of the failure of the Soviet Union. And we've never returned to the conversation about what a democratic world future could look like. So I'm not really talking about a world government per se, but we are getting to a point where we need to have something that functions better than, say, the UN. And so far, honestly, that conversation got stalled in 1939, as far as I'm concerned. We need to relaunch that conversation in a serious way. So in my view, that's kind of where we need to go next, to start to talk about what do we do for democracy globally.
I say we give it over to the World Economic Forum and do 15-minute cities.
Klaus
really
Schwab.
piss everybody off.
Yeah. No, Klaus Schwab has all the answers for sure. So that's the thing, is that that's not the right way forward. We need something that's actually democratic and respects the values, and and I think we need to accept that something like the UN is a nice try, but it didn't solve the problems that the League of Nations sort of created, and we're kind of back at square one. So we've got a lot of work to do going forward, assuming we can keep our democratic countries intact.
There's a lot of history in today's chaos, isn't there? It just repeats itself. It's like cycle
there is
80 years.
Once you start to get a grasp of the history, I really do think it becomes more manageable, but it means a lot of people have to get a grasp of it. So that's really the focus of my work, is trying to help people, understand more of that history.
Well, you've done a great job. You've helped me understand it, and that's hard to do because I am not a bright individual. So I really appreciate you doing that. Dave Troy, you can find everything he does at davetroy.com, on Twitter at Dave Troy, Mastodon. No Blue Sky yet? You're on Mastodon?
I have lots of reasons I'm not on Blue Sky, but okay. Yeah.
All right. Now you made so much sense to me. Now I'm questioning me being on Blue Sky.
All I'm saying is who's paying for it.
Okay. All right. All right.
You may find yourself in a situation similar to what's going on X.
A little Jason Bourne thing? A little.
Well, Jack Dorsey and Musk are pals.
Still.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So you're on
and now, granted, Jack has backed off funding Blue Sky, so far as I know, which means I don't know who's funding Blue Sky.
Someone is.
Somebody for now. We'll see how long it lasts and who buys it.
Well, you're there, not there, but you are on Mastodon. And of course, your podcast, Dave Troy Presents. Highly recommend people put more of Dave Troy in their lives. Not only is he a tremendous investigative journalist, tech entrepreneur, and disinformation research, he's like a Sherpa in the dark night of the bullshit that we all seem to be going through. And dude, you blew my mind today and comforted me a little bit too, because man, oh man, it's been a tough go. You don't know which rail to grab when you're trying to correct the world, right? So for you to kind of deliver that information to us today, and for you to give me as much time as you have, I'm incredibly grateful to have someone like you on the show. So thanks, and hopefully you'll do it again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here. It was a lot of fun.
Anytime. Talk to you soon. That is Mr. Dave Troy, ladies and gentlemen. He is an investigative journalist with the Washington Spectator. He is also a disinformation researcher. He's in Baltimore. I didn't talk about the Orioles. I should have, but I don't think he'd want to talk about the Orioles. My buddy Jay's a big Orioles fan. Does not like talking about the Orioles right now. So they should have done more in the postseason. I don't disagree with him. I don't even know if Dave's an Orioles fan. some of his work. I'd love for you to chase it down. Paranoia on Parade. I've watched it. It's true. Or sorry, read it. It's tremendous. Musk's Twitter buy makes no sense unless it's part of something bigger. That's in the Byline Times. Is really good, and he's really good about getting you to understand what's really at stake here. And he's also an educator, and he's also a reporter, and he's also an expert in the field. So we like to bring those people to you so you can kind of try to understand what's going on around you, which is very difficult these days. I want to thank everybody for being a part of the show. Don't forget, you can watch all of this at Crier Media's YouTube channel. Go to Crier Media at YouTube. We'd love for you to rate, subscribe. Appreciate that. You can also get everything we do anywhere you get your podcasts. Of course, Google does not have podcasts anymore. Go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can check us out there as well. And everything we do is at crier.co. Again, go to crier.co. Thanks, everybody. You can find me on Twitter at It's Dean Blundell. Have a wonderful day. And don't forget to thank our partners and sponsors who made this possible. My wellness carriers, friends at Moment Mushrooms, microdosing experts, one of the greatest resources you can have in your life as far as educating yourself when it comes to treating a variety of issues that you might be coming up with. Listen, psilocybin's kind of this emergent technology, and I'm a big fan. I'm all in. All in. And I'm not just all in from a wellness perspective. I think the business of psilocybin is going to be big business because I think it's going to offer relief to people that truly need it. So if you want to learn more, anything about psilocybin, if you want transformative stories, you want to learn about mushrooms or just the beauty of fungus, go to momentmushrooms.com. Again, go to momentmushrooms.com, and you can join a brand new community as well. We're really happy to be working with our friends over at the Daily Mushroom. Go to the dailymushroom.co. Again, dailymushroom.co. Sign up to become a member. Some incredible studies, the business of psilocybin, the business of mushrooms, the business of alternative treatment, and they'll also connect you with some resources and therapeutics and people who understand it. If you have a lot of different questions, listen, be well. It's really important. I want everybody to be well and go on this journey and do it responsibly. But I'm all in, as should you be. So go to dailymushroom.co, momentmushrooms.com. Thank you, my friends, for making this possible. And thank you, my friends, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.